Hello, everybody. This is Patricia Jurowitz, even though it says talking is Raphael. And I want to welcome everyone today to our webinar on Mining the Disclosures 2017. And we also would like to let you know that this session is being recorded. You can enter questions via the chat box. And at the end, we will also unmute all the lines so that people can ask questions directly. So moving on to the next slide, I would like to introduce our panelists. I myself, Patricia Jurowitz, am the director and founder of Responsible Sourcing Network. Today, we will be hearing from Raphael Laggard, the consultant for Responsible Sourcing Network, who is the lead author of Mining the Disclosures 2017, as well as Jennifer Krause, the Chief Scientific Officer and EVP Operations for Source Intelligence. Source Intelligence is nice enough to be our gold sponsor this year. Next slide. The 2017 Mining the Disclosures report is Responsible Sourcing Network's fourth version of this report. As many of you may have seen in the past, our first report came out in 2014, reviewing the disclosures for Section 1502 of Dodd-Frank, conflict minerals law. And we have been able to dig in deeper into the overall 1,200 disclosures being submitted to the SEC. And we have done a deep dive on 206 of those disclosures, as well as companies' other activities regarding conflict minerals. And so with that, I will turn it over to Raphael, who will be going over all of the results from our analysis this year. Raphael?
Thanks, Patricia. Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here with us. So as Patricia said, I'm Raphael Laggard, the lead author of the report. So I will start by presenting the methodology that Responsible Sourcing Network used for the Mining the Disclosure 2017. So we selected 206 companies from a total of 1,153 filers under Section 1502. These companies are spread among 26 industry groups, and these industry groups are spread among 8 different sectors. So this year we added one industry group, the solar industry group, as an industry with an important growth potential. And together, these 206 companies represent a bit more than $12 trillion. And so we ranked a bit less than half of the total market cap of US stocks. So we ranked companies following 21 key performance indicators. They are spread around 3 themes. So the risk mitigation part, human rights impact, and effective reporting. Each indicator being weighted in reflect of its importance. Some companies included in the 2016 report have not been included this year, and this is due only to the fact that some companies have gone bankrupt or merged, and so are not fitting under the SEC anymore. Next slide, please. So I will start with the metrics and results and the comparative study that we've done between 2017 and 2016. So it is actually the first time that we are ranking the comparative study between 2 years. And in this chart, as you can see, the leading companies, which are the blue ones, so the strong, leading, and superior, have lost a significant share in the total number of companies. And this is actually the main result of this year's report. And we found a dramatic decrease in disclosures quality between 2016 and 2017. So for example, 85% of the companies are in the 3 lowest companies, categories, sorry, the minimal, weak, and adequate, whereas in 2016 it was only 64%. So this pie chart also shows that the performance category with the largest increase is the weakest one, the red one. And this is concerning for the future of companies' due diligence regarding conflict minerals in the future. Next slide, please. So many companies appear to have been minimizing the importance of their conflict minerals due diligence responsibilities. Compared to 2016, all of the industry groups scores decreased, except for one, the packaging industry group. And this increase from the packaging and containers industry group is due to the good scores of two companies, Aptar Group and Crown Holdings. The important thing is that 80% of the samples, the 206 companies, have received lower scores. So if we look a little bit closer to the actual indicators, most of them are decreasing, except for 5 that are increasing just a very little bit. So some crucial indicators are the in-scope determination, which is the ability of a company to determine which of its products are actually under Section 1502, and the supplier verification, which is the ability of a company to assess the veracity of the information that the supplier gave. So I will come back to these scores a little bit later. Next slide, please. So as we can see in this slide, the technology sector is surpassing every other sector in conflict minerals reporting. And this is the same than for 2016, which shows a very strong commitment on the technology companies for responsible sourcing. So out of the 9 companies that are achieving a score of 70 or more, so a score in the blue categories that we saw in the pie chart before, 7 are technology companies. Next slide. On the other side, laggard industry groups and companies are spread among different sectors, but are also the same than in 2016. So despite their low scores in 2016, these companies have received even lower scores this year, which shows some lack of efforts to implement due diligence programs. So for example, the oil and gas integrated industry, so for this industry, none of the companies except for any published the conflict mineral reports, which shows that they are not implementing due diligence. Next slide, please. So another question is how to improve the disclosures. And the first action is to identify the problems. So one strong framework is the OECD guidance, which provides a strong 5-step framework for the implementation of due diligence programs, especially regarding conflict minerals. So the result we found in the 2017 report shows the weakness of the implementation of the guidance in steps 2 and 5. So the identification of the risk and the reporting. So I will start with the step 2, identification and assessment of risk in the supply chain. So the first indicator that particularly suffers from this decreased quality is the in-scope determination, which lost 36 points. And the second one is the supplier verification with 26 points less than in 2016. So if we combine these two indicators, we find that less than half of the companies have actually an appropriate in-scope determination and supplier verification response. This is very troubling, especially knowing that these two indicators are a little bit the backbone of a strong due diligence program. And without them, risk mitigation measures won't be taken or will be taken but ineffectively. The second issue, so the reporting on supply chain due diligence, has suffered, especially for the transparency indicator. So the publicly available information indicator, which is the ability for a company to make information accessible to the public, dropped by 28 points. In 2017, less than half of the companies actually provided adequate information to the public. So this trend shows that companies are applying a compliance-only strategy instead of kind of fully embracing the conflict minerals due diligence, and also go beyond the text of Section 1502. So for example, in 2017, we found that 5% of the companies have a dedicated conflict minerals website, which shows a reluctance to improve independently the due diligence and to follow also the OECD guidance. I also want to insist on the fact that these two examples are the most pressing and visible issues in the disclosures, and that every single step of the OECD guidance should be applied more seriously by companies. So now, what are the strengths of the leading companies, the companies in the blue and dark blue colors in the pie chart? So leaders are implementing measures following two strategies that are complementing each other and are based on strong companies' internal mechanisms. So, for example, the risk readiness assessment, the RRA, developed by Apple, allows companies to assess social and environmental risks in extractive industries and processing. So from there, leading companies have implemented on one side a bilateral cooperation and on the other side a multi-stakeholder initiative. So on the bilateral cooperation with the suppliers, this cooperation is aiming at identifying and responding to risks in the supply chain. So for example, ABB and Qualcomm have visited smelters or refiners. Intel has also visited suppliers to ensure these suppliers understand actually the requirements of the company. Companies like Apple, for example, went even further by implementing a comprehensive review of documents from, for example, NGOs, from governments or research centers. And so Apple was able to identify violence in the Congolese mining industry and consequently the risks for its supply chain. So Apple reviewed 1,300 incidents in 2016, and from there they linked 15 of these incidents to a smelter or refiner. So on the other side, companies are implementing multi-stakeholders initiatives. So for example, the Conflict-Free Sourcing Initiative, CFSI, or the Public-Private Alliance, PPA, and these to address the risk at the industry level. So all the leading companies, Intel, Alphabet, or Royal Philips, are part of the Public-Private Alliance, and they develop underground initiatives to support verifiable supply chains. So another example of that is CFSI with the Conflict-Free Smelter Program that aims at certifying smelters depending on their efforts to reach conflict-free status. These opportunities for cooperation inside industries and also between industries are also completed by some companies with underground conflict-free sourcing initiatives like Solutions for Up or ITSKI. So leading companies, once again, are supporting this kind of programs. So Alphabet is involved in the Gold initiatives of Solutions for Up, and Apple supports USAID program in the Congo. So if combined, these four steps of a company's global response to conflict minerals reduce greatly the risks associated with these minerals. It is pretty much impossible to achieve an absolutely perfect conflict-free status, but as the 2017 report shows, very few companies are actually implementing strong programs to improve their supply chain. Once again, I think that we have to evolve from a compliance-only system to a due diligence system with a large place given to innovation and cooperation between stakeholders. Next slide, please. So now, what about reporting? So as I said before, fewer than half of the companies are in the 206 that we analyzed are taking adequate measures to provide information to the public, and that goes like just beyond simple compliance. So leading companies to answer this issue have taken steps to put in place websites to provide strong information to the public. So for example, Intel is implementing a website with educational videos and all the documents linked to conflict minerals. This step is not a mandatory step. It's not a step that is required by the SEC. The rule states that companies have to publicize the disclosures, but most of the companies only publish them on their investor relations page. But if a company wants to improve and implement a strong due diligence program, transparency is key to its success. In Mining the Disclosure 2017, we saw that less than 5% of the companies actually went beyond this simple compliance and have in place websites with dedicated websites on conflict minerals. The same issue is true for the independent private sector audits, which is encouraged by the OECD guidance. And for 2017, only 8 companies out of the 206 have implemented this audit, which again shows some reluctance to go beyond compliance. Next slide, please. So now, how can investors push for more transparency? I think the first step that investors should take is to require a conflict-free supply chain. And the first thing that they should do is to push for the implementation of Section 1502 and require that Section 1502 is maintained by Congress. And I will talk a bit more about that later. Then ensure that companies' understanding of the importance of conflict-free. So for that, they have to assess the company's understanding of the conflict-free requirements by promoting a long-term supply chain engagement. This effort will lead to a better identification of supply chain risks. Also ensuring that conflict-free is understood as a global and inclusive problem within the companies in which they invest, and that supply chain are included in this understanding. And last part, requiring a high level of reporting from companies. And this year's report shows that the lack of pressure on companies have had negative consequences on their efforts. So investors should push more companies to have a high level of reporting. On the other side, and I think the step 2 of the role of the investors is to encourage a competition between companies to reach a conflict-free supply chain. And for that, the first issue would be to identify the best practices within an industry and also encourage companies, like leading companies, to engage with laggards. The second step would be to encourage companies that are not legally required to fulfill due diligence to actually provide conflict mineral reports, despite not being required to do so. So this is the case, for example, for Acer, that is not required legally to complete a conflict minerals report, but is publishing every year this report. And finally, the idea of rewarding companies that have strong and transparent program, reaching out to companies with disclosures of declining quality, and insist on the importance of risk identification and mitigation, and also to avoid companies that are claiming a conflict-free status without adequate measures. Next one, please. So now, what can business managers and policymakers do? So the first thing business managers should do is to train people in the OECD guidance and due diligence process. One of the weaknesses that we saw in the 2017 report, and probably one of the most important, is the lack of understanding of the requirements. So for example, step 2 and step 3, which are the identification of the risk and the management of the risk, are very often considered as the same steps. And this issue weakens the entire process. Business managers should also try to collaborate more with multi-stakeholders initiatives, but also between companies. Collaboration is key to provide strong mechanisms in conflict minerals supply chain monitoring. So for example, CFSI and other multi-stakeholder initiatives have progressed significantly, and it should be a priority for business managers to follow this kind of initiatives and engage with upstream suppliers and also other suppliers and other companies in the industry. And once again, we need to adopt a due diligence program and to implement incremental and improvement-based policies with innovation. We cannot really stay in the current compliance-only strategies that a lot of companies are currently implementing. And finally, what can policymakers do? And I think that this is one of the most important issues right now. And the main goal of policymakers regarding Section 1502 is to maintain the law. Initiatives have been taken last month to weaken the Dodd-Frank Act and Section 1502. And we should make sure that none of them actually succeeds at weakening even more the law. And this should be one of the main goal of policymakers generally. They should also provide additional guidance. And this additional guidance is needed to provide companies with strong basis for their due diligence programs. So for example, the Commerce Department should develop best practices guidelines that company could use. And finally, we should not forget that Section 1502 has created a momentum all across the world. The European Union just voted a similar law, and China also has similar mechanisms to respond to the risk of conflict minerals. It is important that this policy and that policymakers keep in mind the influence of Section 1502 worldwide, and that they shouldn't repeal or weaken the law. So thanks everybody for listening to me today. I will now let Jennifer from our sponsor, Source Intelligence, talk, and I'll be available to answer any questions you have after our presentation. Thanks.
Well, thanks so much, Raphael, and for that introduction. And Patricia, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My goal today is to really share just some brief thoughts. One is with regard to where we are from a regulatory perspective. Take a look at the history of Dodd-Frank 1502 from a high level. And the reason for this is because I actually believe it plays an important role in the findings that Raphael just shared with us and what the Disclosures report has identified. The report also did a really nice job at identifying several regional impacts, and which we think could be linked to this type of legislation. So I'd like to highlight those as well. I also think it's worth emphasizing that 3TG are referred to as conflict minerals for a reason, and as such, I feel it's a good time, in particular, again, given RSN's findings, to remind ourselves that this is a human rights issue. And lastly, I'd like to share a bit of what we expect to see over the next few months in terms of compliance and transparency. So taking a step back here in time for a little bit, of course, we all know the Dodd-Frank Act was passed in 2010, and in 2012, a challenge to the conflict minerals rule was brought by several business groups against the SEC, basically seeking to either strike down or modify the rule in Section 1502. In April of 2014, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit issued its opinion in this legal challenge to the rule. And in its ruling, the Court of Appeals held that the conflict minerals rule violates the First Amendment of the Constitution to the extent that it requires companies to report to the SEC and state on their websites that any of their products have not found to be DRC conflict-free. So as adopted, the conflict minerals rule required this disclosure, under certain circumstances and depending on the results of the supply chain due diligence. So in response to this ruling, the staff of the SEC Division of Corporation Finance issued a statement on its expectations for conflict minerals reporting in light of the ruling. And basically, the statement documented a couple of things. So first, that companies are not required to use the product descriptors that were otherwise required by the rule. And then second, pending further SEC guidance, an IPSA, or independent private sector audit of a company's conflict minerals report would not be required unless the company voluntarily elected to describe its products as DRC conflict-free in its CMR. So then in May, very early May of 2014, the SEC issued a formal order partially staying the conflict minerals rule that was consistent with the that 2014 SEC staff statement that I just mentioned. And so the 2014 SEC staff statement and that formal order remain in effect. Now, following an appeal process, the conflict mineral rule litigation was ultimately remanded to the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia for further proceedings consistent with, the appellate court decision. So there's a lot of things going on here. Now, let's fast forward to February of this year. There were some news reports, some of you probably, heard about these, that suggested the White House administration was considering a 2-year suspension of 1502. It turns out this was, well, at least at the time, was just sort of, just to quote Adele and one of her songs, rumor simply had it. And then in April 3rd of this year, the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia issued a final statement in the conflict minerals litigation, finding that the conflict minerals rule and Section 1502, as I mentioned, violated the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution with regards to, disclosing that products have not found to be DRC conflict-free, and basically remanding to the SEC to take action in furtherance of the court's decision. So following the final judgment and just a few days later, the staff of the SEC issued a statement indicating that it will not recommend enforcement action to the SEC if companies only file disclosure under items 1.01A and B of Form SD. So these portions of the conflict mineral rule require companies to file a Form SD. So this is very interesting, activities that were taking place early this year, in the spring of this year. Now, even more recently, now this was in June, so early summer, the House, the Republican-controlled House, passed the Financial Choice Act, and the idea behind the Financial Choice Act was to overhaul the country's financial regulations, but there was language in the FCA relevant to repealing Section 1502, and then just last month, the House, several weeks ago, the House backed a $1.2 trillion omnibus spending bill. And in that bill, there is a single line amendment that cuts off funding to, and I quote, implement, administer, or enforce, unquote, the regulation. So again, these are proposed laws that passed the House and still need to be considered by the Senate. But I took the time to go through this and to outline all of this different activity, because basically what it did was it caused a lot of confusion, misunderstanding, frankly, a distraction from due diligence activities with, and these are actual words that we heard, speaking with both issuers and non-issuers, and frankly, folks from within the public sector as well. And so I think this frustration, this uncertainty, and confusion, frankly, and undoubtedly influenced the trends that Raphael was just sharing with us, and that the RSN has uncovered in their report. So one of the things, Raphael, you just mentioned was the overall decreasing score trend, and that 80% of companies in the sample have lower scores. My sense is this is directly related to the activity that we saw in April that I just talked about. The report noted that some companies appear to be minimizing the robustness of their conflict minerals due diligence responsibilities. This is likely directly related to, one, either electing to not file a CMR, or two, to significantly reducing the amount of information that was contained in that CMR. Possibly also likely related to this recommendation to not enforce the rule. The report noted, the Minings and Disclosure report noted that there was an increase in Form SD filers only. So again, directly linked, I think, to what we saw happen earlier this year. There were still very few IPSAs that were completed. That was not so much of a surprise. I didn't really expect anything different, to be honest. And and I don't necessarily believe that this low number of IPSAs denotes a reluctance to go beyond the rule to independently improve supply chain risk, because in our experience, I mean, certainly what we've seen is that many companies were still conducting audits, but they were internal audits, which obviously they just don't simply report out on. Certainly not externally, but maybe internally. So again, from my perspective, the drop in scores doesn't necessarily indicate that companies aren't investing in supply chain transparency and due diligence. It could just mean that they're not saying as much in their public disclosures. We saw that filers cut back significantly in what was included in a CMR, and many didn't even submit a CMR. So again, it just could be that they're cutting back in terms of what they're reporting, but not necessarily that they're cutting back in terms of what they're doing. So the action didn't stop in June or July, or in August. There were a couple of Democratic lawmakers, Senators Waters and Moore, that wrote to the SEC chair, urging him to ensure that due diligence reporting requirements of the regulation are enforced, describing the regulator's non-enforcement position as, and I quote, misguided and irresponsible. And one of the issues that the senators raised is that companies would face significant reputational risk as a result of reduced transparency in their supply chains. The senators also noted that Dodd-Frank 1502 has had a positive effect on the sourcing of minerals from the DRC, and the RSN highlighted several of these, and I just wanted to point them out, because I think it's important. I think it's important to keep in mind that policy can indeed affect change. But mining, certification has made progress in the region, and a good example is the implementation of the bilateral German-Congolese cooperation project. So that project was aimed at developing the certified trading chain scheme, and that scheme is focused on 3TG. In fact, it's projected that by the end of this calendar year, 20% of the mines, which actually represent 60% of the mining production, will be certified through either government organizations and third-party auditors. So that's good stuff. Similar efforts have been led by ITSE, so the tin industries program, where they've seen some pretty good results in the production and exports from certified conflict-free mines, obviously particularly in the tin ore sector. The ICGLR, the International Conference of the Great Lakes, they've got a regional certification mechanism that provides a certification path for exports of conflict minerals. So, all of these different things have led to, some of you may have seen the recent United Nations, the Group of Experts report on the DRC that basically acknowledged, the positive results of some of these mine certification schemes in the region. And the improvements, achieved with 3TG, the 3TG mine certification, unfortunately, been a little bit more challenging for gold, and that's highlighted as well in the report. And the difficulty in certifying these small-scale mines, and the fact that gold is very easy to smuggle because you can smuggle it out in small quantities, which are of high value, has made it challenging to trace. But there's a handful of schemes that are under development to try and address this. The Just Gold project of Partnership Africa Canada is looking at implementing a certification process, and the USAID has supported a capacity building program for a responsible minerals trade. So again, there's some improvements being made even in the very challenging gold tracing arena. And I might also add that here at Source Intelligence, we were so fortunate to host Garrett Moore with Stand with Congo earlier this year, and he came and spoke with us, and he shared the film When Elephants Fight. And if any of you have a chance, I'd certainly encourage you to view the film. It truly is a powerful expose, but his words and the words that we heard from the people in the film were just, I found humbling, but so encouraging because they were filled with hope. So change is taking place, and it is having an impact. So why is this all important? Well, it's important because we're talking human rights here, and there's no doubt that businesses are conflicted, maybe even divided on the merits of Dodd-Frank 1502. But the fact is that minerals due diligence is a human rights issue, and whether Dodd-Frank survives this administration or whether future policy is put into place that requires supply chain transparency or supply chain tracing, companies can choose to do the right thing with respect to ensuring their products are sourced and manufactured, distributed, and even disposed of in a way that doesn't violate human rights. When we talk about human rights, I mean, it's a broad umbrella term. It includes activities that constitute modern slavery. It encompasses actions such as human trafficking and forced labor, such as child labor, bonded labor, domestic servitude, even, the unlawful recruitment of child soldiers. I mean, all of these just heinous activities lead to violations of the most basic human rights. If you look at the numbers, there are about 40 million people were trapped as slaves last year, mostly women and girls, in forced labor and forced marriages. And this is according to the first collaboration between the ILO, so the International Labor Organization, Walk Free Foundation, and the International Organization for Migration. I mean, that number, 40 million people, that number is staggering. But here's the even more concerning part. It's likely conservative. So if you think about the supply chain, the highest tier, or that point of origin, is what? It's typically a mine or a farm. And it's economically, socially, and politically vulnerable workers that are easy targets to fill labor shortages. And minerals extraction in the DRC is an example of that. These individuals are likely skilled, less skilled, and so human rights violations tend to be more prevalent in lower or unskilled labor environments. And these are also dirty jobs, and I'm not talking, the micro dirty jobs. I mean, these are ones that are dangerous, they're difficult, and they're typically lower paying and undervalued by society and easily filled by the vulnerable workers. The U.S. State Department puts out a neat report every year. It's the Trafficking in Persons report. It's a very extensive, comprehensive view of human trafficking across the globe. The 2015 report dedicates a whole section to the risk of human trafficking in the supply chain. It does a pretty nice job of identifying supply chain risks associated with human trafficking. It looks at the use of migrant workers and seasonal labor recruiters and their agents. And even fierce competition can result in what I call los olvidados, or the forgotten ones. They're isolated, they're disconnected, easily just exploited. But believe it or not, I think, there's a silver lining to this, if we could call it that. And I think it's that we're getting better at documenting human rights abuses and human rights issues in supply chains. There's commonality beginning to form in terms of how to measure and report out on these issues, and businesses understand, and frankly, because many of you have felt it firsthand, that these violations can have detrimental impacts on their brand and profitability. So what this does is it presents continuous opportunities for leadership, and leadership to affect change, whether from within the government, private sector, or not-for-profit sectors. I mean, the great work that the RSN is doing, that's a terrific example of leadership in the area. So, now's the time, putting this back in the CM context. Do you want to wait and see what happens with Dodd-Frank 1502, or do you want to continue to implement supply chain due diligence relative to 3TG? Or do you expand beyond 3TG and assess risks associated with all extractives and raw materials? So just to finish up here, I think I'm getting close to my time. Every now and then I think it'd be nice to have a crystal ball, but then again, I don't know. But what do we expect to happen in the short term and the longer term? Well, I can tell you what I think is going to happen in the short term. For the most part, it's business as usual. Companies are moving forward with their reporting year 2017 programs. Whether or not they will be required to file in 2018 is still open. But here's the deal. Consumers are now driving transparency, so it's not something that's just going to go away in the near term. Many millennials are also all-knowing and understanding. They want to know what goes into the products they purchase and use. They're not going away anytime soon. In fact, it'll be interesting to see how this mindset changes as this population ages. But many of the businesses are starting to craft their own internal policies with regard to supplier codes of conduct. They're identifying specific expectations with regard to supplier labor practices, commitments, and performance, and ethics. So I think due diligence is the best way for risks to be managed in a scalable and sustainable fashion. So, is Dodd-Frank Section 1502 going to go away? The one thing this administration has done consistently is being consistent. So it's keeping us on our toes, so who knows? But, for those of us who are truly committed to making this world a better place for subsequent generations, we get it, they get it, and they're committed to implementing smart, thoughtful, and realistic initiatives that, are going to be profitable and ethical. So I'll finish up there. I'll turn it back over to the Responsible Sourcing Network so we can continue on with the program.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. Incredibly important information that you covered, both with the latest information on the legality of 1502, as well as the overall focus on achievements that have been made in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So thank you so much for all the information you just provided for us. We did put into the chat box a reminder of going ahead and submitting your questions through the question interface on GoToWebinar. And you also have the opportunity to raise your hand, and we could go ahead and unmute you so that you could ask the question yourself. We do want to remind everybody that you are able to download the report itself at sourcing-network.org/mining-the-disclosures-2017. Or you can go ahead and get there through clicking on the minerals section of our website. And in addition to, and actually if you could forward to the next slide, please. In addition to being able to download the report, I also wanted to let you know that we have a interactive bar graph on our website where you can sort the bar graph by company name, by industry, or by score. And you can see that in both bar graph format as well as a table, and allows you to easily sort all the results of the 206 companies that we did the deep dive on. We will be posting our slides to the website as well once we are able to pull those all together. And so there was a question earlier on that was submitted, and that was in regards to the leaders and laggards. And so Raphael, if you could speak a little bit more to that, if you're looking at overall of the full sample group, the 206 companies that you were looking at, or if it more had to do with looking at who the leaders and laggards are within specific industries.
So yes, thanks, Patricia. I was looking at first the industries. So the 3 leaders and 3 laggards that I showed were the industry groups. But in these industry groups, usually the companies are also or leaders or laggards. Like for example, if you take the, as I said, the technology industry, the technology sector with the industry groups, semiconductors, communication equipment, and computer hardware. These are the 3 leaders industry groups in our ranking, and these are also regrouping most of the companies leading the ranking. Regarding to the laggards, the 3 industry groups that I showed, so oil and gas, building materials, and steel, also regroup most of the laggard companies, except for some companies that are in other industry groups. Most of the laggards are in these 3 industry groups. Back to you.
Okay, Patricia. Great. Yep, thank you. There is another question here talking about the pie chart. I believe that's on slide 5, so maybe you want to go back to that slide. Somebody didn't quite understand the details of the 2016 versus 2017, and
okay.
Just looking at that, yeah, maybe you could speak to that a little bit, and if each of those do indeed add up to 100%.
Okay, so each part of these pie charts represent companies having scores above 90, above 80, above 70, etc., and until 40 and 40 or less. So the 15% or 25% or 35% are the percentage regarding the 206 companies, and how many companies are in this group, the different categories. After the comparison between the 2 pie charts, so my point was to show the laggard companies are more and more numerous, as we can see with the red part of the pie charts. So it comes from 61% in 2016 to 81% in 2017. Whereas leaders, so what I call leader is the 3 different kind of blue, are more and more scarce. So for example, the 25% in 2016 for the strong category to 4% in 2017.
So the percentages are percentages of the 206 companies that were reviewed. They're not numbers of companies, correct?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, thanks. And I'm just going to double check with my management team here, my communications team, to see if anybody's raising their hand, because I don't have visibility to that. So just checking, but I do have a couple other questions that have been submitted. Okay, no hand raising. So another question, Rafael, is if you could speak a little bit more about how companies should be reporting on risks identified and risk management strategy, and which companies to look for best practices.
So for best practices, I think that I told a little bit, I described a little bit the companies. These are mostly companies in the tech industry. So we have, for example, Intel, that is the leading companies for the whole ranking with more than 90% score. We also have Apple, that is ranking very, very well, and has an approach that is a bit different than other companies. An approach that I would say is more global. They introduce more innovation to actually ensure that the due diligence is effective. We also have Qualcomm, which is one of the leading companies, Alphabet, Google, and Royal Philips. So these are the main companies that are leading the ranking. We can also add outside of the technology industry, for example, General Electric, or also in the technology industry, we have HP and Nokia. And what was your first question again? Sorry.
No problem. It had to do with, and if you could give any specific examples, not maybe just the company names, but how companies should be reporting on the risks identified and what their risk management strategy is. How can they improve?
Okay, so
what should they be doing to improve risk management strategy?
Okay, so as I said, most of the companies consider, in the disclosures, consider the step 2 and step 3 of OECD a little bit as the same, and they mix a little bit the two. I think that companies should really focus on the identification of the risk for now, and the management of the risk will come very logically after. So identification of the risk, that is like identifying the risk in the products, but also identifying the risk in the mind, for example, like Apple does with reviewing documents from NGOs and governments. So I think these are the main steps that the companies should follow. For managing the risk, I think it also really depends on which risks are identified, but different systems exist. And first, I think it's building a very strong due diligence team in the company to actually maintain databases to manage these risks.
Thank you. And maybe Jennifer could comment on this first, and then Rafael, we could also hear from you. But in regards to seeing a decrease in the quality of companies' disclosures, did it appear that companies were not abiding by their legal obligations? Since I know, Jennifer, you dug into that a bit.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I don't know that it necessarily, if you're talking specifically about the content, I don't know that it necessarily reflects that they weren't abiding by their, the legal requirements. Now, if an issuer, just didn't file, period, then I think that would be more of a legal question with regard to compliance and the actual content. I mean, I think if the effort was made to file and a decision was made internally not to submit a CMR based on, the SEC statement in April of this year, I understand that. I think that the biggest issue is whether, the company didn't file at all period. That's really more of a legal issue there, from my perspective. I'm not a lawyer though, but from my perspective.
And Raphael?
Yes, I think I agree with Jennifer. However, I think it's a little bit hard to know if the companies are not following legal requirements, for the simple fact that they're pretty much the only ones knowing about their supply chain. So if they only file an SD form, it is hard to imagine that they are actually doing everything they can to follow the legal requirements. And as we saw in the 2017 report, the number of SD form-only filers is increasing. So yes, I think some companies have the possibility to not really follow the legal requirements.
And were there any companies that did not file SDs or CMRs this year that did in the past of the sample group that you looked at?
Yes, we have so one company, which is Walmart, used to fill, I think, SD, SCM, and CMR documents, and this year they just didn't fill anything.
Great. I'm going to read these last two questions together so we have time to talk about it and then do a quick wrap up at the end. So one is, how can a company swing by 10 points or more and not change their SD CMR data in any significant way? And the other is, if the criteria stayed the same as last year, or if criteria was more difficult this year and thus the scores went down. So Raphael, maybe you could take that, and if you need me to repeat that second question, I can.
Yeah, I think the answer for both questions is pretty much the same. So for Mining the Disclosures 2017 at Responsible Sourcing Network, we decided that after 4 years of filings, companies should be able to provide more qualitative disclosures. So we didn't change the indicators themselves or the rating of the companies. We just implemented the rating in a more strict approach, I would say. For example, for each indicators, we have an emplacement where the information is to be found. And in the past, we have accepted indicators that were not filled in the right place. Or, for example, in this year's report, we stuck to this approach, and we decided that every emplacement of the information should be clear and should be respected. So this explains some difference in score.
Great, thank you. And if you move on to the next slide, I just wanted to show you a quick visual of what our interactive pie chart looks like. So you can see the difference in scores in that, excuse me, not pie chart, bar graph. And as I mentioned, it's sortable. And in the table view, you just click on the title of the column. And there we go. We're having a quick little demonstration there of how you can sort the overall bar graph. Thank you, Cyrus. And on our last slide, we have the full URL of the different, that will take you directly to that portion where you can look at the interactive bar chart as well as download the report. And again, I would like to thank our gold sponsor, Source Intelligence, as well as the rest of the sponsors that make this report and this research possible, Ropes and Gray, Conflict-Free Sourcing Initiative, and As You Sow. Thank you so much, everybody, for your attention. As I said, the webinar is recorded, so those that want to see it afterwards could go to our website, and we'll get the slides as well as the recording posted there as soon as possible. Thank you very much, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.